There we go.
Perfect. Go ahead and get started. All right. So taking a step back here and considering with the Sunday plan, what is our approach to lawn care, right? And the reason that we focus on this is with weed control specifically, it is a slightly different approach, right? And there are a couple of other factors here that we would like to emphasize. So traditionally, the three primary components of lawn care are herbicide application. So generally at the beginning of the season, you might see a pre-emergent or essentially a preventive treatment to prevent weed seeds from germinating. Essentially, the second focus will also be on fertilizer. And then the third focus, which will be a little bit smaller than both the herbicide application and the fertilizer, would be your cultural practices. So for example, mowing the lawn and watering the lawn over the course of the season. And that is really what the traditional approach consists of, right? A very heavy emphasis on the herbicide application and the fertilizer to potentially mask some underlying factors at play. And then the cultural practices play a smaller focus over the course of the year. With the custom lawn plan, however, our focus is really placing the primary focus on cultural practices, right? So instead of relying on a pre-emergent, for example, at the start of the season here, we really want to determine why are these weeds appearing, right? So if the lawn currently has a significant number of weeds, there is an underlying factor at play, which is essentially preventing that turf grass from crowding out these weeds or essentially allowing these weeds to take hold, right? So if we're able to essentially consider these factors at the beginning of the season, have a better understanding of the lawn, we'll be better prepared to both account for these issues over the course of the season and to minimize them as we progress over the course of the year and into future seasons as well. Additionally, we'll place a heavier emphasis on essentially following proper mowing height, for example. So not just recommending that you mow the lawn, but really considering we're mowing in a fashion that is essentially not going to be stressful to the grass, and we're maintaining as thick of a canopy as possible to essentially crowd out those weeds. Now, herbicide application is still a component of our plan, right? We do offer 2 spot treatments, which we'll discuss in more detail here in just a few moments. But this is more so as if the weeds start to pop up, then we can treat as needed, right? We don't offer anything that's going to prevent those weed seeds from germinating. And so the focus is modify the environment. Anything that does pop up, we can account for and proceed from there. And lastly, of course, the bread and butter of the plan, fertilizer, the nutrient pouches are certainly a core component of the custom lawn plan. But again, keep in mind that the cultural practices are a significant component of the plan. So transitioning into some of these cultural practices from a watering perspective, watering is one of those factors that is very easy to either overdo or underdo, right? And depending on that, we may see some weeds start to pop up in extremely moist soil. So for example, nut sedge, and then we may see some weeds that tend to appear in soils that are watered a bit more shallowly or essentially have maintain a moist soil surface rather than focusing on a deep and infrequent schedule. So being able to consider essentially how much water is being provided, we may be able to rely on some of these weeds as essentially indicators of what's occurring and be able to adjust our schedule from there. In terms of specific watering notes here, keep in mind with very clay heavy soils, our focus is essentially making sure that we allow this soil to dry out, right? And so one of the components that we see is essentially if we're following this deep and infrequent watering schedule, we can run into either concerns with runoff, right, where essentially the water isn't saturated or penetrating into the soil, and then we're essentially not being able to utilize that water, or essentially that if we so runoff, or if essentially once we water and that area is actually remaining too moist, right? So if we put too much water down, then we could run into issues where essentially it's not draining properly, even if the soil surface is. So with soils with very high clay content, our focus is essentially introducing cycle soaking. So still focusing on a deep and infrequent schedule, but instead of, let's say, just taking an average of maybe one watering for 30 minutes or so, right? If one watering session would consist of 30 minutes, instead of watering for 30 minutes at one time, we would break that up. So essentially water for as long as we could until that water starts to pool or starts to run off a bit, allow it to saturate, water for, again, until that water is essentially starting to pool, allow it to saturate, and then complete again. So generally, on average, let's just say if our desired durations of watering of 30 minutes, maybe break it up into watering for 10 minutes, let it saturate, water for 10, let it saturate, and water for a final time. On the other extreme, however, for sandy soils, we want to consider that essentially the soil is not going to be able to hold on to that water or retain that water quite as well as a clay soil, right? So we will have to keep an eye on the grass health. We may need to water a bit more frequently than if you do have a high clay content or a soil with a high clay content. Thirdly, in terms of how much water to put down, one of our focuses over the course of the season is to make sure that you do complete an audit of your sprinkler system. So what this consists of is essentially using sprinkler gauges, for example, as highlighted in the picture on this slide. Some will also use a uniform surface, just like a tuna can. Definitely easier to go with the sprinkler gauges. Set them up throughout the lawn, run the sprinklers for a set period of time, calculate how much water was put down, and then from there, we'll be able to adjust how long we need to water to put down the desired amount of water. So typically anywhere from about 3/10 of an inch to 1/2 inch of water per session is what we're looking to put down. And it's always good just to essentially dig into the soil to depth of about 4 inches or so, just to see if we're reaching that desired depth when we're watering, really providing water to encourage those deep roots. And lastly, be mindful of weather. So one of the difficulties that we can run into, or one of the issues, essentially setting the sprinkler system and then forgetting it, right? And so if you do have a good amount of natural precipitation, Ivana, you might be able to chat about this as well. I believe you had some good rain over the past week. Then we can essentially hold off on that watering schedule running just as needed.
And another thing too about auditing your sprinkler system, this is a great time to check if you've got any broken nozzles or if something is just spraying where it's not supposed to. I know some places get really windy, so just accounting for that as you set your sprinkler. So auditing is something really important. We usually recommend to do it, first thing of the season, right before your first water or during your first water, just to make sure, everything's going where it's supposed to. And yeah, if you're having a ton of rain, Texas just got hit with, super rainy days, super cloudy days. You don't want to water at all during that period. I haven't watered my lawn and I probably won't until next week or the week after, just because you want to make sure that it fully drains. You're not going to deal with any fungal issues that might come up or any weeds that really like, a lot of water.
So secondly, with mowing, right, not necessarily as simple as you may have thought for mowing as a kid. I know when I used to go around and mow the lawn, I always thought it was just essentially walk out and mow the grass. I didn't place too much thought into making sure that essentially the mower blade is sharp, or essentially how much grass I was removing during one cut. So this is really the two primary points that we want to keep in mind here. So at the start of the season, we do recommend sharpening your mower blade just to make sure essentially we aren't tearing at those grass blades, if you will. So what we can see, especially as the season starts to progress, it'll almost look like the grass is starting to enter dormancy, right? Or we'll start to see these patches develop. And when we actually look at close-up pictures of the blades, you can see that they're essentially jagged, right? From that grass or from that mower blade, essentially tearing at the blades instead of cutting out a nice point. So stressing the grass here. Additionally, keep in mind, however, that if we're essentially tearing at the grass blades instead of having a nice clean cut, we may be removing more than the desired amount per session or per cut. So generally, our recommendation is to never remove more than 1/3 of the grass blade's length during one cut. Any more than that, you can run into issues with the grass being stressed. So again, very easy if the blade isn't sharp to run the risk of essentially removing more of the blade in one cut than we'd prefer. Secondly, mow high. So as included here in the mowing chart, we've highlighted the warm season grasses, generally a little bit shorter of a height than some of the cool season grasses further north, but general recommendations, cutting when the grass reaches a height of about 3 to 4 inches or so, down to a height between 2 to 3 inches, and just making sure again that you're not removing more than 1/3 of the blade during one cut. So what this means is if we are able to essentially keep the grass at a fairly long length, we're going to be better able to essentially crowd out weeds, for example. We'll be able to maintain a thicker canopy, and we'll also be able to, again, just make sure that the grass isn't going to be stressed by keeping the grass too short, for example. Thirdly, to be able to promote this greater or the longer length and essentially not remove too much during one cut, this does mean that you may have to mow more frequently, right? So it's not necessarily a bad sign if you feel that you do have to mow, what would you say, about once?
Once a week for me, honestly. So anywhere in the, Central Texas area, probably about once a week.
And then lastly, the note here in regards to bagging or clipping. So if you chat with us or if chat with the yard advisors or take a look at our blog, I'm sure one of the more popular articles is focused on grass cycling. So essentially not bagging your grass clippings. And the thought process here is essentially it is a good idea to not bag your clippings and return those nutrients to the soil, as long as there isn't a weed issue at play, right? We want to make sure if there are, or if there is a significant number of weeds, that we're containing that weed seed and not essentially encouraging additional spread. So if you do have a significant number of weeds, we can always essentially mow while bagging your clippings to contain the seed and then be able to address the area from there.
And we did have a question from someone who registered. They put that question in the registration, just about, preventing weeds after initial treatment. And these two things are basically the most important ways to prevent weed spread after, you've killed off a lot of them. Keeping the grass healthy and not stressed is, a great way to keep it from to crowd out weeds. And also, mowing high will make sure those weed seeds don't receive enough light, and watering deeply and infrequently will make sure weeds like crabgrass with very shallow roots are not going to be able to survive. So the thought behind this is just making the environment the best place for your grass so it can fight off any weeds that might try to take hold.
And thirdly and fourthly, amending and repairing the lawn. So with amending, so once you receive your soil test, your soil test results, we'll have a better understanding of essentially your specific soil, right? And essentially how much organic matter we have. We do need to chat about essentially the soil pH, but those are the two primary factors here I'd take a look at. Cation exchange capacity is a great factor to consider as well, along with the nitrogen release, but not as critical, I would say, from this perspective, as the organic matter content and the soil pH. So with organic matter, generally lower organic matter, most likely not going to be able to retain moisture quite as much, right? And so we could run into issues. So going back to the idea of a sandy soil, well, we would have to keep a greater eye on essentially just making sure that the lawn is receiving enough water, but also making sure that essentially if there is a low organic matter content, or if it's a depleted soil, for example, then it may be a situation where essentially it's not a very nutrient rich soil, right? And we can run into difficulty there with, even if there is soil there, it's not necessarily the optimal quality. So what we can look to do is essentially top dress or add top dress material throughout the lawn to essentially begin to build a new layer of soil over time and improve the existing soil as well. So sort of on the one extreme, compost is a great option, right? So adding compost will certainly improve from a microorganism standpoint and from a nutrient perspective. But biggest factor there is just making sure that we do keep in mind that it's essentially fertilizer, right? Make sure that we space out compost applications with our pouches and making sure we're not applying it if stressful conditions such as an extreme heat wave are coming up. Turkey compost is a great option as well. And then topsoil I would view as more of on the other extreme from compost, right? As it's not quite as nutrient dense, right? But it will help just sort of build up that soil structure, if you will. From a pH standpoint, if you have a very acidic soil, then we may discuss adding lime or essentially incorporating lime applications over a number of years. This typically is not a one-time application, right? This is something that we would need to incorporate over multiple seasons, but can certainly be beneficial to consider. Essentially, simplified note here, but essentially if we run into extreme pHs, then essentially the nutrient availability from the soil can be limited depending on which end of the spectrum we're at. And if you have a very alkaline soil, then adding a bit of peat, mulch, or compost. So really adding compost is going to help just from a nutrient perspective, but then also if it's a very basic or alkaline soil, that'll also help bring down the pH a bit as well.
Something to keep in mind with top dressing is it's kind of just the universal equalizer. So if it's too acidic, you can put compost and it'll balance it out. If it's too alkaline, same issue. If it's not, a super severe case, it's the same thing with a sandy or clay soil. It will mitigate the sand, allowing for more nutrient retention and water retention. But on the flip side, it will also break up the clay and allow it to drain more easily and allow it to access more nutrients there as well.
And this then brings us to repairing, right? And so amending the soil and repairing the lawns are typically two factors that we like to recommend completing together, right? Or they're definitely great factors to consider at the same point. So depending on the type of grass you have, seed may be the best option. Bermuda is certainly a great warm season grass to essentially establish from seed, germinates fairly quickly, will establish fairly quickly. Zoysia, centipede, are also great warm season grasses that you can establish from seed, but they can take a bit longer to establish, right? So they won't have essentially a nice thick lawn as quickly from seed for Zoysia and centipede compared to Bermuda. For St. Augustine, it may be beneficial to consider sod. Plugs are also an option, but St. Augustine doesn't produce viable seeds, so we would have to look at a separate form of propagation to repair areas of St. Augustine. But again, sod is really the sort of the extreme route that we can take with any of these grass types, right? And if there's a significant area that we're looking to repair, we want to essentially minimize the amount of bare soil as quickly as possible. Sod's a great option. One note that I'm sure Yvonne will bring up here as well, especially with her St. Augustine, is in some situations beneficial if you consider the topsoil or the top dress to essentially be encouraging new growth, right? Then adding a bit of topsoil can sometimes actually help speed up the repair process. So for example, if you have St. Augustine and there's some thinner areas of grass, it may be that we can essentially just add a bit of topsoil, scuff up the area a little bit, and the grass will naturally spread back into that area as long as there isn't a separate factor at play, right? We wouldn't necessarily need to take the extreme route of looking to install plugs or install sod. But so certainly a good tip to keep in mind that adding topsoil or top dress is certainly a great option.
Yeah, this is something that I've seen a lot this year, especially in the southern US with the kind of late freeze that we had after a particularly warm winter. I've noticed a lot of weed germination, especially in my own lawn. So just making sure as I remove those weeds, adding some topsoil down so the St. Augustine can fill in. And right now temperatures are great for St. Augustine. It's really going to start to pick up. It spreads fairly quickly, especially in a healthier lawn. So, if you put down some top dressing now anywhere until temperatures start to reach, high 70s, now is a great time to start to fill in those bare areas without having to add any plugs or sod.
All right, Yvonne, I realize I am hogging up the majority of the time here, so I'll get moving. So, so once we start to chat about some of these weeds, one of the first questions we ask is essentially, what type of weed is it? And so the easiest way to break the weeds down are considering if it's broadleaf in nature. So simplest way to think of broadleaf, I think of leafy weeds, right? So think of dandelions, clover, plantain, for example, anything that's more leafy again. Whereas grassy weeds are going to resemble turf grass more, right? So think of your crabgrass. And generally, broadleaf weeds will be able to utilize one of our selective herbicide or our selective herbicide, dandelion doom, since it doesn't resemble turf grass. It's a bit easier to essentially control these weeds. Whereas the grassy weeds, it's a bit more difficult to rely on a selective herbicide. We most likely will have to resort to a non-selective herbicide. And so with the herbicide application, we touched on this at the beginning of the webinar here, but as a brief recap, so Sunday does not offer a pre-emergent, right? And so while the thought process with a pre-emergent is essentially to apply preventative treatment at the beginning of the season to prevent these weed seeds from germinating, that's great until essentially we have to account for, well, why are these weeds present, right? And so that pre-emergent is going to allow a seed bank to begin to accumulate. And as long as a pre-emergent is applied, we're not going to be able to exhaust that seed bank, right? And while we're applying a pre-emergent as a blanket treatment, we are treating for weeds that may not even be there. So with Sunday, our focus is essentially, instead of allowing the seed bank to continue to accumulate and essentially being reliant on this pre-emergent, let's just address why these weeds are present. And then if any do appear, we can then spot treat them so we never end up having the seed bank accumulate, right? And so the two herbicides we do offer are dandelion doom, which is what I would think of as our selective herbicide. It won't damage turf grass when applied as directed. And it's effective against most broadleaf weeds. So again, think of clover, dandelions. And then Weed Warrior is our non-selective herbicide, which is effective against both most broadleaf and grassy weeds, but it's non-selective. So if it is applied to actively growing turf grass, it will damage the turf as well.
And before getting into the weeds I realized, I want to be mindful of your time. So we may go over, if that's the case, we will have that recording available after this. But we did have a question from our customer asking about moss. And you are correct in that it is a pH issue a lot of the time. It does like to grow in acidic soils, but it could also be a couple other factors. It could be staying too moist or too shady. So I would try to address those two things first. They're a little bit easier. But if you've exhausted both those options, you should look into applying a lime treatment, like we mentioned, into that area. If you do just want a spot treatment, the dandelion doom is effective against moss, but in order to change that environment, the three things you'll want to look out for are shade, acidity, and watering as well. All right, let's take a look at some common weeds, and I'll try to go through this a little bit quickly, but I do want to touch on a few things. So clover is something we will see a lot of the time. It's present in, most lawns. For the most part, it's going to be in areas that are a little bit less nutrient rich. So sometimes it's a sign of, just not having enough nitrogen in your soil. It does make its own, which is why it likes to be in those soils with a little bit less nitrogen. So, if you start to notice it pop up, it's not something that I'm usually too concerned about. I kind of like to leave it because it's actually benefiting your soil over time. If I'm trying to tackle a lot of weeds, this will be the last one I try to tackle because, again, it's actually kind of helping your soil. Also, the birds and bees love it, and I'm a sucker for pollinators. So, what can you do? But if you would like to remove it, dandelion doom is effective against clover. And then I did also want to touch on, if you're seeing something that looks similar but is maybe a little bit harder to remove, oxalis is most likely the culprit. And it doesn't have the same benefits as clover, but it is pretty cute. So you could think about leaving it, but dandelion doom will also remove that as well. And then I think the next one, yeah, is spurge. So this one is something I really want to touch on because people will start to see this a lot. And this is something that is a really great indicator weed because it really only grows where it wants to, and that's somewhere that is either very nutrient dense or very dry. So if you start to see this, this is a great time to start top dressing that area, maybe give it a little bit more water. It really just wants a very desert environment. You see it a ton in Arizona. I remember pulling it from my lawn in Arizona constantly, no matter where it was, even in the most, hottest temperatures, it's there. So it is easy to hand pull. I would recommend starting with that. The only thing is that it is a euphorbia. So it has this milky sap that can be an irritant to your skin. So I just want to make sure you wear gloves when you pull it. Some people react worse to it, but you don't really want to gamble with that. So make sure to wear gloves when you're hand pulling it. It is more resistant to herbicides. So I would say, try to start with that. If not, you can try our weed warrior. But again, you would have to repair that area afterward. Nutsedge is kind of my nemesis. Nutsedge is something that will pop up in more waterlogged soils or soils that are very compacted. So even if you know that you're watering the right way, if these pop up, this is most likely a sign that it's time to aerate. It's a little hard to hand pull. They have these bulbs under the soil. So if you pull these, like a hydra, it will actually sprout two more. So you don't really want to pull these. They're very resistant to herbicides, so they're pretty difficult to remove. The main thing I like to do is just, keep mowing over them, and it'll exhaust that bulb over time and they'll start to die out. You'll kind of notice them in the lawn because they'll look pretty different from your grass. They have these very glossy, shiny leaves that kind of sprout out and over the turf. So once you start to see these, take a look at your watering first. And then if everything looks good there, then I would look into aerating. And I would like to point out now is a fantastic time to aerate in the South. Do it now before putting down any seed or sod. Or top dressing because it is a great option if needed. Ants first. Okay, this is something that's going to be, like it says, in sandier soils, in looser draining soils, something that's a little bit, it doesn't hold a lot of nutrients, it doesn't hold a lot of water. So if you see these, now is the time to top dress. They have those little burrs on them. They'll stick to your skin, they'll stick to your pet's fur, they'll stick to your clothes. There is another burr type weed. I'm blanking on the name right now, lawn burrweed, I think, which has this similar characteristics. They both can be treated the same way. They like it hot, they like it dry. You'll start to see it in the summer. This is something that you'll want to just keep mowing over, making sure you exhaust it. Again, you can use the weed warrior, but you will have to patch that area. This is a little tip that I have started using when I start to see it. If you just want to make sure that it's not going to get into your house and hurt your pets a little bit, or you don't want to step on those stickers, which is how we call them in Texas. The seeds are called stickers. If you throw a wool blanket over that area and drag it over, all of those seeds will stick to that blanket. And then, you can hose it off, somewhere concrete. So the seeds will either go away, or you can try washing in your washing machine, but I don't recommend that because they might get stuck. So try washing it off first, and then you can wash the blanket like normal. And dollar weed. So this one, I think, is the last one. So this is something that you'll see in very water heavy areas. So you might just see little patches of it right next to your your hose attachment. You'll start to see these little guys pop up. There is a weed that looks very similar to it called dichondra, which you may see. It is actually native to some places in Texas and Arkansas, Louisiana, those areas. But that's just, these two are both kind of just showing you that you need to reduce the water in that area. But again, just like nutsedge, if you're watering appropriately, it may be time to aerate. But both this and dichondra are very easy to hand pull, and you can use dandelion doom on them as well. So these are kind of just a good little indicator. They don't usually spread too much. If they do, then you've got a wider problem, most likely that it's not draining very well. But for the most part, they stay kind of localized to an area with too much water, and you can hand pull them very easily.
And Ivana, real quick, just highlight what you said, right? And
Yeah.
sometimes it'll seem like watering schedule on point, it's not a drainage issue, and then we can realize it's a broken sprinkler head, right? Or
Yep.
a failure play there, right?
Mm-hmm. So if you've looked at every option after that, you just kind of want to audit anything in that area. It's possible that even, I did have an area of these in my lawn, and I was trying to figure out where that was coming from. It's because my gutters were clogged and the water was draining into that area, falling into that area. So looking at environmental conditions like that as well is important. Oh yes, one more, crabgrass. How could I forget you? Crabgrass is something that, basically every lawn's gonna see. You're gonna have it pop up. It's a very opportunistic weed. So anywhere that your grass is struggling a little bit, it's gonna be there. There are a few things to do to keep it from spreading. Make sure you're mowing often and bagging your clippings to get those seed heads to get out of there. It really likes mowed short lawns. So you'll most likely see this in a Bermuda lawn, or if you're mowing too short in your St. Augustine or zoysia, this will also pop up. It really wants the crown, the middle of that plant, to receive sun. So it's really important to mow high to make sure that you're not letting it get any sun, and it will start to die back because it's not receiving what it needs. It's also thriving in lawns that get shallow, frequent waterings. So this is another thing, if you start to see it spreading very quickly, it's time to adjust your watering. And you see there in that top picture, there's also some spurge. So it's most likely that this lawn drains super quickly and they water it very often. So usually that's great for sandy soils, but it might be time to amend with some top dress if you start to see all these weeds, because what's great for sandy soils is also great for those weeds as well. And it does spread very quickly. So I recommend once you see it, hand pull it if you can. And if not, go ahead and use the Weed Warrior and then patch that area, because you don't want these to spread. All right, I marathoned those.
Perfect. Well, thank you, everyone. So we truly appreciate you staying late with us. It was a pleasure chatting with you. So keep an eye out for the follow-up survey. Again, this was dealing with weeds for southern lawns. Feel free to submit any questions to webinars@getsunday.com. If there are any questions, please feel free to submit them here over the next couple of minutes. But yeah, it was an absolute pleasure. We hope to see you at a future webinar, and have a great rest of your day. Take care.
Take care, y'all.